The sound of iron striking iron echoed through the courtyard. Slow, rhythmic, merciless, each strike landed on a shackle, and with it, the muffled grunt of a boy who did not cry. Around him the air shimmered with heat, sand stuck to blood. In the city of Basra, under the empire's burning sun, slaves were branded not just on flesh, but on silence, and among them stood one, a boy with no tears, no words, and eyes like still fire. His name was Zayd. They said he was taken from the Nubian plains, stolen at 8, sold at 12, and owned by silence itself. His new master, Harun al-Fadl, was a merchant of men, a man whose house smelled of saffron and cruelty. To Harun, Zayd was a shadow to command, a pair of hands to carry the burdens of another man's life. To the other slaves, Zayd was a ghost. He never spoke, never wept, and never broke. At dawn, when the call to prayer spread across the rooftops, Zayd would stand by the stables, brushing the horses with slow, deliberate strokes. His eyes never lifted, but he listened to every whisper, every insult, every drop of spilled wine in the merchant's courtyard. He listened as men plotted, as wives wept, as slaves disappeared. Words became his fire, silence became his weapon. One evening, when the merchant's drunken laughter rolled across the courtyard, a woman's cry cut through it. It was Amina, another servant, barely older than Zayd. She had dropped a platter. In Harun's eyes, that was enough. The lash came down once, twice, thrice, and still. Zayd stood still, his eyes locked on the red-stained dust. When Harun turned to strike again, the boy stepped forward, not with rage, but with the calmness of something ancient and watching. Enough, he whispered. It was the first word he had spoken in years. The whip fell silent. The courtyard froze. Harun stared at the boy, this piece of property who dared to speak, and laughed. Then came the punishment. That night, they beat him until his breath came in gasps, until his silence returned. But something changed. Beneath the bruises and the broken ribs, a flame had awakened. He had spoken once, and now the silence burned differently, heavier, sharper. From that night on, the boy's eyes no longer watched. They measured, and far beyond the walls of Basra, history waited for a storm named Zayd. The Tigris glimmered under the moon like a blade waiting to be drawn. Somewhere along its banks, in the quiet slave quarters behind the merchant's estate, Zayd's breath came in shallow rasps. His wounds had not yet closed. The scent of iron and ash clung to him like memory. Amina knelt beside him, wringing a damp cloth. "You shouldn't have spoken," she whispered. Her voice trembled. "He'll kill you next time." Zayd didn't answer. His eyes were open, tracing the cracks in the clay wall. Every sound in that silence felt amplified. The shuffle of guards' boots, the distant thud of drums from the city's festival, the soft murmur of the river beyond. He thought of home, though home was a word fading from his mind. Once, there had been tall grass and laughter in a tongue he barely remembered. Then came the chains, the march north, the ships. Basra had stolen everything from him, his language, his family, even his name. Zayd wasn't his name. It was the one the merchant gave him. But for now, he wore it like armor. Weeks passed. The wounds hardened into scars, and Zayd returned to work. He lifted sacks of spice in the market, ran errands through alleys that stank of sweat and salt, and learned the rhythm of his master's cruelty. Yet beneath his quiet, something else grew, a kind of listening deeper than sound. He began to notice things, which guards drank more than they should, which overseers gambled late into the night, which slaves whispered of escape when they thought no one heard. He saw cracks forming in the order that ruled their lives. He said nothing, but he remembered everything. One night, he was ordered to deliver goods to the docks. The moon was full, and the wind smelled of the sea. There, between the ships, he met a man named Rashid, a sailor with a scar that split his lip in two. Rashid looked at the boy's silent stare and said, "You're not like the others, are you?" Zayd said nothing. Rashid leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Word is, something's coming. The slaves in the salt fields. They're gathering. They're tired of dying quiet." For the first time, Zayd's gaze flickered. That night, he stood at the edge of the river, watching the current carry the moonlight downstream. His reflection wavered, broken by the ripples. The face of a boy fading into something harder, something that would not stay silent forever. In the stillness, the wind whispered through the reeds, and Zayd finally smiled, a thin, quiet curve that promised reckoning. By dawn, the air above Basra thickened with the scent of salt and sweat. The city never truly slept. Its markets murmured even at night, merchants shouting prices into the darkness. But beneath that noise, in the quarters where the enslaved lived like shadows, another kind of whisper began to rise. It was not about prices or spice or ships. It was about freedom. Zayd listened. He always listened. Days turned into weeks. And he learned more from silence than others did from speech. The rumor Rashid had shared was true. In the salt fields of Al-Batai, south of Basra, a rebellion was stirring. The slaves there were men like him. Black men from Africa, Persians, even Arabs who'd fallen into debt or disgrace. They had toiled in the salt marshes until their skin cracked open, their lungs burned, and their masters forgot they were human. Zayd began to notice strange movements in the market. New faces that came and went too quickly. Coins passed from hand to hand. Coded phrases muttered between tradesmen. At night, he met Rashid again, this time in a derelict storehouse near the docks. Inside were 5 men and 1 woman. All of them bore the same mark of servitude somewhere on their skin. A single lamp flickered between them. Rashid introduced Zayd. "He's young, but he listens better than most who speak." The group spoke in low, urgent tones of the marshlands, of salt caravans, of a man who had begun to unite the enslaved under a banner not of tribe or faith, but of pain. They called him Ali ibn Muhammad, a mysterious leader claiming descent from noble blood. He preached justice, vengeance, equality. His words, Rashid said, make men remember they were once free. Zayd sat silent through it all. When Rashid asked what he thought, he simply said, "Words are fire. Fire can burn the wrong way." There was a murmur of laughter, but Rashid understood. The boy was cautious, cold, not because he didn't care, but because he'd learned that hope could be a noose if held too early. Later that night, as he slipped back through the alleyways, Zayd passed a group of guards, dragging a man through the mud. The man's face was unrecognizable, swollen, bloodied. A voice called after them. He spoke of the salt fields. Zayd froze in the shadows. He watched the guards disappear, then turned toward the direction they'd come from, the dock where Rashid's group had met. His heart hammered. The fire was spreading faster than anyone knew, and in its reflection, Zayd saw not chaos, but calling. Rain came to Basra that season, heavy, unrelenting, the kind that turned dust to blood-red mud and washed secrets into the streets. The city's walls dripped with the weight of it, and even the call to prayer sounded muffled under the storm. For most it was a mercy. For Zayd it was a veil. He moved through the market with a crate on his shoulder, head bowed like any other slave, but beneath the dripping cloak, tied to his chest, was a folded scrap of parchment. It carried a message written in coded verse, destined for the salt fields. A message from Rashid's underground circle. By now the whispers had grown teeth. Slaves disappeared in the night. Some escaping toward the marshes, others caught and never seen again. The guards had doubled, and Harun al-Fadl's temper had worsened. Each lash he gave seemed less about discipline and more about fear. Zayd's silence had become a kind of invisibility. Harun barely looked at him now. He was furniture, a fixture in the estate, and that was what allowed him to listen, to learn. One night, when the storm was at its loudest, he found himself summoned to the main house. Harun sat before a bowl of figs, his eyes red from wine. "Zayd," he said, his tongue thick and slurred. "I hear the slaves in the south are plotting foolishness. Do you know of it?" Zayd lowered his gaze. "No, master." Harun smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes. "Good, you're loyal. You've always been quiet." He stood, walked around Zayd, circling him like a vulture. "I need eyes in the quarters. You'll tell me if anyone speaks of rebellion." "Yes, master." When Zayd left the room, the rain had stopped. The city smelled of damp clay and betrayal. He walked to the edge of the courtyard, his bare feet sinking into the mud, and looked at his reflection in the puddle. The boy who stared back was no longer the same one who had arrived in chains. His silence was no longer submission. It was strategy. 2 nights later, he slipped away from the estate. Guided by moonlight and memory, he followed the river south. The journey was brutal. Days of mud insects, hunger, and the stench of salt that clung to everything. But by the 5th night, he reached the edge of the marshes. There, under a makeshift tent of palm fronds, he saw them, dozens of men and women, their eyes fierce, their bodies lean from labor. They stood around a tall man with a green turban and a voice that carried like thunder. "Ali ibn Muhammad," someone whispered. Zayd listened to the man speak, of justice, of vengeance, of a world reborn through fire. And though he said nothing, something inside him answered. The campfire crackled, scattering sparks into the blackness above the marsh. Shadows moved between the reeds. Men and women hardened by work, their faces lit by flickers of red light. They had once been slaves of salt and sweat. Now they gathered as soldiers of silence and rage. Zayd sat among them, motionless, his eyes fixed on the man who had called them here. Ali ibn Muhammad was no ordinary preacher. His words struck like hammers, measured and deliberate, promising not comfort, but purpose. "They call you slaves," he said, his voice deep and steady, "but you are the builders of their wealth, the bearers of their cities, the labor of their God. You are the ones who have already conquered death." A murmur swept through the crowd, not of joy, but of recognition. They believed him because pain had made truth simple. When Ali's eyes passed over Zayd, something lingered. "You," he said, "you have the quiet of one who has watched too much." Zayd didn't respond. Rashid leaned close and whispered, "He sees more than he says. That's his strength." Ali nodded once, then turned back to the crowd. "Tomorrow the salt fields will burn. Let every lash they gave you echo back 1,000-fold." That night, Zayd lay awake beside the dying fire. The marsh smelled of salt and decay, but also of freedom. Men sharpened makeshift blades. Women prepared torches soaked in oil. Some prayed. Others whispered farewells to ghosts. Zayd touched the scar on his chest, the mark Harun's whip had left years before. He remembered Amina's trembling hands, the cries that filled the courtyard, the laughter that followed. Every memory was fuel. When dawn came, the marshes erupted. Hundreds of slaves surged toward the salt fields, their shouts tearing through the mist. They overran the overseers, stormed the storehouses, set fire to the very earth that had enslaved them. Flames devoured the salt pits, painting the horizon with orange and black. Zayd moved through the chaos like smoke, silent, precise, unshaken. He tore down chains, guided others through escape routes, and when a guard drew a blade against Rashid, Zayd caught his arm and drove the knife into the man's chest. He did not flinch. By nightfall, the salt fields were theirs, as the rebels gathered around the fires, drenched in sweat and victory. Ali ibn Muhammad raised his hands. "This is only the beginning," he declared. "Basra will hear your silence. The Caliph will tremble before your fire." And standing behind him, bloodied and still, Zayd's gaze met the horizon, the direction of the city that once owned him. In his silence, vengeance had found its voice. The dawn after the uprising broke a red, not with light, but with smoke. The salt fields of Al-Batay burned for 3 days straight. The air tasted of ash and iron. Those who had once worked, the pits now stood atop the ruins, their skin blackened by soot, their eyes lit with something dangerous. Belief. Zayd stood among them, his tunic torn, his hands blistered from the fight. He watched the fires without blinking. Around him, survivors wept, prayed, or cheered. But Zayd remained still. His silence had weight now. It drew people's attention even when he spoke no word. Ali ibn Muhammad rode among the rebels on horseback, his green banner fluttering against the haze. The Caliph in Samarra will send his men, he warned. The Abbasid armies will come for us, but we are no longer slaves. We are soldiers of justice. The crowd roared. Over the next weeks, the marshes transformed into a fortress. Tents were raised, stolen weapons polished, food gathered from sympathetic villages, men trained with crude spears, women forged blades from broken plows. Rashid taught small groups how to ambush supply routes, strike fast, and vanish into the reeds. Zayd, though young, was different. He didn't just fight, he observed. He watched the patterns of the patrols, studied how Ali commanded the masses, how words could move men more powerfully than swords. One evening, Ali summoned him. The leader's tent smelled faintly of musk and parchment. "You are quiet," Ali said, pouring water into a clay cup. "Yet your silence speaks. You carry no tribe, no claim to power. That is good. The fire that hides burns longest." Zayd bowed his head. Words invite ears. Silence invites action. Ali smiled faintly. "Then you will act. I need someone inside Basra. We must know when the Abbasids will strike." The task was almost impossible. Basra, heavily guarded and on edge, had become a trap for anyone connected to the rebellion. But Zayd accepted without hesitation. His path was leading him back to where it all began, to the merchant who had once owned him. That night, he set off alone, slipping through the fog. The reeds whispered as he moved, the river guiding him north. By the time he reached the outskirts of Basra, the air had changed, thick with tension, soldiers, and suspicion. At the city gates, a guard stopped him. "Where are you from, boy?" Zayd lifted his eyes, calm and empty. "From the salt fields," he said softly. "A slave escaped when the others burned." The guard spat. "Then you'll find new chains here." But as they dragged him toward the city prison, Zayd's lips curved. A faint, hidden smile. He had returned to Basra not as a slave, but as the fire that moved in silence. Basra, the city that once glittered with trade and poetry, now reeked of fear. Its streets were crawling with soldiers in black turbans, the Caliph's banners fluttering above every gate. The markets that once echoed with laughter now whispered in dread. Everyone had heard of the Saltfield uprising. Everyone knew the fire was coming north. Zayd walked among them unseen. His wrists bore fresh rope burns, his clothes torn to look like those of a beaten runaway. The guards who'd captured him had thrown him into a slave pen near the docks, a place filled with the broken and the forgotten. It was exactly where he needed to be. By night, through the thin walls of the pen, Zayd listened. He listened to soldiers complain about long patrols, to merchants bribing guards for protection, to whispers about a secret Abbasid caravan carrying gold and arms from Baghdad to Basra. Every detail was a thread, and he wove them quietly into a pattern of war. Days passed. Zayd earned the trust of a guard named Faris, a young man disillusioned by his duty, who often lingered by the gate to share stories. One night, as rain slicked the mud beneath them, Faris leaned closer. "They say the Caliph's army will march south in 2 weeks," he muttered. "They're waiting for the shipment from Baghdad. Once it comes, they'll crush your kind in the marshes." Zayd nodded, silent, as though the words were meaningless to him. But inside, he marked the time. The next night, he slipped his bonds, moving through the dark like a shadow. He found the caravan yard, a line of camels, crates and soldiers dozing by dying fires. The stars above glimmered faintly through the mist. He moved quietly, cutting a single strap here, loosening a wheel there. And when he reached the largest cart, the one bearing the Abbasid insignia, he poured oil along the tarps, then struck a spark. The flames caught instantly, devouring wood and cloth. Within moments, the entire yard was ablaze. Panic erupted. Soldiers shouted, tripped, dragged water buckets in vain. Zayd disappeared into the chaos, slipping through the smoke toward the riverbank. By dawn, he was gone, swallowed once again by the marshlands. When he reached the rebel camp, Rashid met him by the fireside, eyes wide. "You made it." Zayd said nothing. He simply opened his hand, revealing a torn scrap of parchment bearing the Abbasid seal. Proof of their plan. Ali ibn Muhammad read it in silence, then looked up. "The Caliph will send his army," he said slowly. "But now we are ready." Zayd turned toward the horizon, where Basra's smoke still rose in the distance. The city that had enslaved him was now trembling, and the silent fire had only begun to burn. The march to Basra was like no other. Not an army of discipline and banners, but of fury and remembrance. The roads trembled under the weight of barefoot men and women, their chants echoing across the desert plains. "For the salt, for the blood, for the chains broken." At their head rode Ali ibn Muhammad, robes billowing like a prophet's cloak. But behind him, silent and steady, walked Zayd, his blade wrapped in cloth, his eyes fixed on the horizon. To him, Basra was not a city. It was a wound that had never healed. By the second night, they reached the outer farms. Smoke curled from the fields, set alight by retreating Abbasid patrols. The rebels moved like water, swift, unseen, cutting supply lines, seizing food, freeing the enslaved laborers who still toiled in the orchards. When they approached the first of the city's gates, the defenders, mercenaries mostly, shouted curses from the ramparts. Zayd raised his hand, signaling the front ranks to halt. He studied the walls, remembering every stone, every alley beyond. It was the same gate through which he had once been dragged in chains. Rashid came beside him. "The gates won't open easily." Zayd nodded. "Then we don't open them. We drown them." That night, the Zanj dammed the irrigation canals that fed Basra's outer moat. When dawn came, they broke the dams. The water surged like unleashed vengeance, flooding the lower ramparts, rotting their foundations. As the guards scrambled to hold the walls, the rebels struck, ladders rising through mist and smoke, cries piercing the dawn. Zayd was among the first to climb. His hands bled against the rough stone, but his movements were sure, his silence absolute. When he reached the top, he drove his blade into the throat of a guard and pulled himself over. For the first time since his enslavement, he stood within Basra's walls as a free man. By midday, the outer defenses fell. The city burned. Slaves turned on their masters. Soldiers deserted. Chaos bloomed like fire in the courtyard of Harun al-Fadl's estate, the place where his chains had first been fastened. Zayd found him. The merchant was older now, fatter, but his eyes still held the same cruel glint. He fell to his knees, clutching a bag of gold. "Please, Zayd, mercy. I raised you, I fed you." Zayd looked at him, this man who once called him property, and said nothing. He drew his blade slowly, the same deliberate motion with which he'd brushed the horses long ago. When he was done, he washed his hands in the fountain. The water ran red, then clear. Outside, the sounds of battle grew distant. The rebels had taken Basra, yet as Zayd stood in the courtyard of his past, the victory felt hollow. Freedom had come, but it spoke in the same language as vengeance, and deep inside, the silent fire began to wonder if it could ever stop burning. The victory at the marshes spread like wildfire through the south. word reached the cities in trembling whispers. The slaves had beaten the Caliph's army. For the first time in generations, the powerless had carved a wound into the empire's pride. Basra's merchants locked their gates. The governor ordered new walls, new patrols, new gallows. But fear is a slow disease, and it spread faster than any order could stop it. In the heart of the rebellion, Ali ibn Muhammad declared the founding of a new city, Al-Mukhtara, the Chosen. Built from the bones of abandoned villages, it became the Zanj capital, half rising from water, half from ash. There, amid the sound of hammer and chant, Zayd walked like a man half remembered by the world. His rank had grown. Men followed him, whispered his name in reverence. Yet he remained what he had always been, the still center of the storm. Rashid once joked, "If Ali is the tongue of this fire, you, my friend, are its breath." But Zayd felt something else beneath the triumph. A shadow forming behind. Ali's speeches, the leader's sermons, had changed. Once he spoke of justice, of ending chains. Now he spoke of destiny, of divine right, of his bloodline. One night, as the new city slept, Zayd and Rashid met beside the canal. The reeds swayed in the warm wind, and frogs croaked in the dark. "He's turning this into a kingdom," Rashid said quietly. "Not a cause." Zayd's eyes were fixed on the distant fires of Al-Mukhtara. "All flames want to be suns," he said. "But suns burn what they claim to light." Still, loyalty bound him. Whatever Ali was becoming, he was the reason thousands had risen. And Basra, the city of his chains, still stood untouched. That unfinished wound would not let Zayd rest. Then came the summons. A messenger arrived at dawn, breathless. "The Caliph's reinforcements have entered Basra. Their general commands 5,000 men. They are preparing to strike the marshes again." Ali's council met in haste. Some urged defense, others retreat. Zayd said nothing until the shouting ceased. Then with calm finality, he spoke. "We take Basra first." The room fell silent. Ali looked at him, the quiet boy from years ago, now a soldier forged in silence and smoke. "You would march into the lion's den." Zayd met his gaze. "The lion once held my chain. It's time I held his throat." And so, under a sky the color of blood, the order was given. The Zanj army began to march north. As the first torches lit the road to Basra, Zayd felt something colder than fear rise within him. It was not vengeance anymore. It was reckoning, long delayed, perfectly silent. The march to Basra was like no other. Not an army of discipline and banners, but of fury and remembrance. The roads trembled under the weight of barefoot men and women, their chants echoing across the desert plains. "For the salt, for the blood, for the chains broken." At their head rode Ali ibn Muhammad, robes billowing like a prophet's cloak. But behind him, silent and steady, walked Zayd, his blade wrapped in cloth, his eyes fixed on the horizon. To him, Basra was not a city. It was a wound that had never healed. By the second night, they reached the outer farms. Smoke curled from the fields, set alight by retreating Abbasid patrols. The rebels moved like water, swift, unseen, cutting supply lines, seizing food, freeing the enslaved laborers who still toiled in the orchards. When they approached the first of the city's gates, the defenders, mercenaries mostly, shouted curses from the ramparts. Zayd raised his hand, signaling the front ranks to halt. He studied the walls, remembering every stone, every alley beyond. It was the same gate through which he had once been dragged in chains. Rashid came beside him. "The gates won't open easily." Zayd nodded. "Then we don't open them. We drown them." That night, the Zanj dammed the irrigation canals that fed Basra's outer moat. When dawn came, they broke the dams. The water surged like unleashed vengeance, flooding the lower ramparts, rotting their foundations. As the guards scrambled to hold the walls, the rebels struck, ladders rising through mist and smoke, cries piercing the dawn. Zayd was among the first to climb. His hands bled against the rough stone, but his movements were sure, his silence absolute. When he reached the top, he drove his blade into the throat of a guard and pulled himself over. For the first time since his enslavement, he stood within Basra's walls as a free man. By midday, the outer defenses fell. The city burned. Slaves turned on their masters. Soldiers deserted. Chaos bloomed like fire in the courtyard of Harun al-Fadl's estate, the place where his chains had first been fastened. Zayd found him. The merchant was older now, fatter, but his eyes still held the same cruel glint. He fell to his knees, clutching a bag of gold. "Please, Zayd, mercy. I raised you, I fed you." Zayd looked at him, this man who once called him property, and said nothing. He drew his blade slowly, the same deliberate motion with which he'd brushed the horses long ago. When he was done, he washed his hands in the fountain. The water ran red, then clear. Outside, the sounds of battle grew distant. The rebels had taken Basra, yet as Zayd stood in the courtyard of his past, the victory felt hollow. Freedom had come, but it spoke in the same language as vengeance, and deep inside, the silent fire began to wonder if it could ever stop burning. Basra lay in ruins, smoke curled from every quarter, the stench of burnt oil and flesh drifting across the canals. The once golden city, jewel of trade and learning, had become a graveyard of empire. The caliph's banners were torn, the mansions looted, and the silence that followed was heavier than war. Ali ibn Muhammad entered the city at dusk, surrounded by his guard. The people, those who survived, watched from shattered doorways as the preacher-turned-commander proclaimed his triumph. "From this day," he declared, his voice echoing across the ruined square, "the chains are broken not by mercy, but by justice. The caliph's shadow ends here." Cheers rose from the Zanj ranks, but among them, Zayd stood apart. His face, streaked with soot and sweat, was unreadable. Around him, the victors feasted, sang, and claimed the spoils of their tormentors. Rashid came to him, holding a cup of water. "It's done," he said softly. "You've avenged it all." Zayd took the cup, but did not drink. His gaze moved across the city. The corpses in the alleys, the sobbing of freed women, the flames licking at the old mosques. "Avenged?" he murmured. "There's no measure for that word." In the following days, Basra became a stronghold. The Zanj fortified the gates, repurposed the armories, and raised their own banners over the governor's palace. But victory had a taste that soured quickly. Supplies dwindled. Disease spread among the crowded quarters. The conquered city began to rot from within. Ali's peaches grew sharper, almost fevered. He spoke not of rebuilding, but of purging, of divine right, of his destiny to rule. The followers who once saw him as a liberator now began to whisper that freedom was being replaced by fear. One night, as rain tapped against the stone walls, Rashid entered Zayd's quarters in haste. "They've executed dissenters," he said. "Ali's men killed 3 who questioned his rule." Zayd looked up slowly. "The fire eats what it touches." Rashid's eyes hardened. "He listens to no one now, except maybe you." Zayd said nothing. He walked to the window, staring out over the city. From the palace courtyard, the glow of torches burned bright. By dawn, he requested an audience with Ali. The pump leader received him in the governor's old chamber, now draped with green and gold. "Zayd," Ali said, smiling thinly, "the city is ours, yet you look as if you mourn." "I do," Zayd replied quietly. "Freedom shouldn't look like this." Ali's expression darkened. "You forget yourself. Without me, none of this would exist." Zayd met his gaze. "Without us, neither would you." For a long moment, neither moved. Only the sound of distant thunder filled the air. When Zayd left the chamber, Rashid was waiting in the corridor. "Well?" Zayd's face was carved from stone. "He's building a throne from the ashes of our chains." and somewhere inside him, the silent fire began to shift. Not outward, but inward. Toward reckoning once more, the storm broke over Basra like judgment. Thunder rolled across the sky, rain washing the soot from the streets but not the blood. Inside the governor's old palace, now Ali ibn Muhammad's fortress, the air was tense, thick with the murmur of distrust. The revolution that had begun with unity now strained beneath the weight of power. Zayd moved through the corridors in silence. He saw guards whose loyalty was bought, prisoners who were once allies, and fear. The same fear he had seen years ago in the eyes of slaves before the lash. It was a bitter truth. The faces had changed, but the silence was the same. That night, Rashid came to him again, soaked from the rain. "He's ordering purges," he said. "Anyone accused of disloyalty, even some of our own." Zayd's jaw tightened. "Then the fire has consumed its keeper." "Zayd," Rashid whispered, "we didn't fight for this. You've seen what he's become. If you don't stop him, no one will." Zayd said nothing. He stared into the flickering lamplight, the same glow that had once reflected in his chains. Then he stood, wrapping his cloak around his shoulders. The fire must be silent again. When he entered the audience hall, Ali was alone. The preacher's green banner hung behind him, wet from the leaking roof. Its color darkened to near black. He was writing a proclamation, a decree of executions. When he looked up and saw Zayd, a faint smile curved his lips. "You return to me like a son," Ali said. "Will you not rejoice that the Caliph trembles at our name?" Zayd's voice was low, steady. "I came to remind you that the Caliph isn't the only one who should tremble." Ali's eyes narrowed. "You speak against me?" "I speak for what you were," Zayd said. "You taught us that fire burns chains, but now you forge new ones in the same heat." Ali rose, anger flaring. "You think yourself my judge, slave?" Zayd stepped closer, the rain hammering the roof. "No," he said quietly. "I was your silence, and silence remembers." What happened next was quick. A flash of steel, a single breath. When the guards burst in, Ali ibn Muhammad lay slumped against the table, blood spreading through the parchment of his own decree. Zayd did not flee. He stood still, sword dripping as thunder cracked overhead. The guards hesitated. Some fell to their knees. Others backed away. None dared speak. By morning, Zayd was gone. Some said he vanished into the marshes, others that he was taken by the river itself. His name became legend. Zayd al-Nar al-Samit, Zayd the Silent Fire, the slave who rose in silence, burned an empire, and vanished in his own ashes. Years later, old rebels would whisper that sometimes, in the salt fields at night, when the wind moved through the reeds, you could still hear the sound of breath. Quiet, deliberate, unbroken, the silence of a man who had spoken once, and the world had burned to listen. If Zayd's fire moved you, if silence spoke louder than words, then don't let this story end here. Subscribe, and keep the flame alive. More untold histories, more voices that refused to die, waiting in the shadows. Hit that bell. Let the silent fire burn on.